When I was asked if a camera was good in low light, I had to think about it. It took me a while, but I'd say it depends. What are you planning to shoot? Is it a picture? Is it a video? Are there moving subjects or are they stationary? I'll start with photography. I've shot the night sky with a long shutter speed and a low ISO. I've also shot that same night sky with a low shutter speed and a high ISO. This picture is a perfect example. The shutter was open for 10 seconds and it had an ISO of 2500. This second picture was taken the same night in a slightly different location. Because there was a little bit more light, I decided to go a different route and go with a faster shutter speed and a higher ISO. You can notice a lot more grain, especially because of the lighter colors. I've shot people and moving objects, but it all comes down to one major question. What is acceptable to you? While you're shooting, you're taking into consideration three things: the shutter speed, the aperture, and the ISO. You can compensate for light using any of these, but the big question is there movement? If you're shooting a moving subject, you need to make sure your shutter speed is fast enough so you don't get any blur. This could require you to shoot either wide open or with a high ISO. The downside of this is if your aperture is too fast, your focus point will be super thin. Also, if your ISO is too high, you'll get a lot of grain. Which brings me to the lack of movement. If your subject is stationary, you can shoot with the long exposure. Your aperture can be wide open with the low ISO, and you won't have to worry about movement, grain, or losing focus. This is another great example of a photo that I took out in La Jolla, California, where I used a long shutter speed, with an added bonus of capturing the headlights and taillights of passing cars. Now, switching subjects to video, this is where things get interesting and a lot more limitations come out. Touching on shutter speed first, it's standard practice to have a 180-degree shutter speed. What this means is setting your shutter speed roughly double that of your frames per second. For instance, if you're shooting at 24 frames per second, you want your shutter speed to be as close to 1/48th of a second as possible. 30 frames per second, 1/60th of a second. 60 frames per second, 1/120th of a second, and so on. This takes the shutter speed out of the equation for controlling the light getting to the sensor. This leaves the aperture and ISO. Let's look at the aperture. We can shoot wide open, allowing in as much light as possible, but now we have to worry about the focus. In low light, autofocus does not work well, so we're going to be left with manual focus most of the time. For some, this isn't an issue. For others, it might be a deal breaker. Last, we have the ISO. Like I said earlier, as the ISO increases, so does the grain. In my opinion, anything over an ISO of 6400 is going to have too much grain and is then unusable. I know this doesn't really answer the question, but I'll leave you with this. How much noise and grain do you find acceptable in your pictures and videos? This is the number one thing that truly limits the low light capabilities of this camera, but that comes down to your own personal opinion as to what you find acceptable and what isn't. If you don't mind the grain or your current project isn't affected by the grain, then you have no problem. Otherwise, you might want to look at something like the A7S or A7S II. I hope this video helped. If you liked it, click the like button. If you want to see more, subscribe, and I'll be continuing to post videos regularly.